I had sung at 43 funerals before I sang at his brother's. I know that number because I counted them. Every single one. Not because they haunted me, though some of them did, but because counting was the only way I stayed sane. It was the only thing that kept the job from becoming my whole identity. I was Lenora Vesper. I was 28 years old. I worked in cemeteries and cathedrals and cold stone chapels that smelled like melting wax and old grief. And I was running out of time. The Cathedral of the Bleeding Heart was packed that evening. I had never seen so many armed men pretend to pray at the same time. They sat in rows with their big hands folded in their laps and their eyes scanning the exits. Their suits were black and expensive. Their faces were stone. The coffin at the altar was polished mahogany, buried under white lilies that cost more than my rent. Julian Devereux, 26 years old. Shot 3 times in a parking garage on a Thursday afternoon. I did not feel sorry for him. I couldn't afford to feel sorry for anyone anymore. Feeling sorry took energy, and I needed every scrap of energy I had for surviving. I stood behind the altar in the small vestry, adjusting my veil in the cracked mirror. My hands were perfectly steady. They were always perfectly steady now. I had trained them to be. My phone buzzed once in my hidden pocket. I didn't need to look at it. I already knew what it said. Third pew from the back. Left aisle. The man in the gray tie. Count the guards at the side door after the first verse. That was my real job. That was why the black requiem paid for my sister's hospital room, the tiny apartment we shared, and the food on our table. That was why I sang at funerals for the most dangerous men in the city. Not because I had a beautiful voice, though people always said that I did. Not because I believed in God, though I used to. But because 3 years ago, a man knocked on my door and told me that my sister Clara's experimental treatment cost $400,000, and that he had a very simple way for me to earn it. I sang. They listened. And buried somewhere in the tempo of my hymns, in the spaces between the notes, was information that kept their enemies bleeding and their ledgers full. I was the weapon nobody ever suspected. A funeral singer. A curse, they called me in the underworld. 4 men had died within hours of my singing at their services. People whispered that I was bad luck. That death followed me like a loyal dog. They were right. But not for the reasons they thought. I stepped out from behind the altar into the candlelight. The cathedral went completely silent. And then I began to sing. I chose Lacrimosa that night. Mozart's Cry for the Dead. My voice climbed into the vaulted ceiling and spread through the cold stone space like smoke. I felt it leave my body the way it always did, like something separate from me, something I could not claim. My voice belonged to the grief in the room. The rest of me was already working. 3 guards at the side door. 1 rotating. Gap every 90 seconds. I filed the information away. I kept singing. I was halfway through the second verse when I felt it. A shift in the atmosphere. The specific weight of someone looking at me too hard. Not admiring. Not grieving. Studying. I let my eyes drift, just slightly, to the front pew. There was a man sitting there who had not been there when I started. He must have entered after the first note, which meant he had been late, which meant he was not afraid of being noticed, which meant he was either arrogant or powerful. Or both. He was tall even sitting down. Dark hair. A jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something that didn't know how to be soft. His suit was charcoal gray, immaculate. His hands were resting on his knees, and they were not folded in prayer. They were completely still, which was somehow worse. His eyes were on me. Not on the coffin. Not on the priest. Not on the ceiling or the candles. On me. I had been watched before. Men watched me at these things all the time. They were curious, suspicious, or simply bored. But this man was not watching me the way other men watched me. He was watching me the way a person watches something they recognize but cannot place, like a half-remembered dream. I did not falter. I never faltered. My voice held perfectly, and my face stayed still behind the veil, and I finished the hymn with my hands clasped and my eyes downcast. When the last note dissolved into the stone walls, there was a silence so complete I could hear the rain hitting the stained glass windows. Then someone in the third row quietly broke down. I turned and walked back behind the altar. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall and breathed. My hands were shaking. That had never happened before. I pressed them flat against the wall and waited for them to stop. His name, I found out later that night from a contact who owed me information the way most people owed money, is Rafael Devereux. The dead boy's older brother. The head of the Devereux syndicate. The most dangerous man in this city. I lay on my narrow mattress that night with Clara asleep in the next room, her breathing slow and steady through the medical monitor that kept us both awake most nights, and I stared at the ceiling. I had spent 3 years building a wall around myself. Brick by careful brick. Every funeral was another stone in that wall. Every lie was mortar. I was sealed inside it so completely that nothing could get through. But something about the way Rafael Devereux had looked at me made me feel like he already had a blueprint of every crack. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. He found me again 4 days later. I was singing at a small burial near the East Cemetery. A nobody's funeral. A low-level man whose family couldn't afford flowers, so they put plastic ones on the grave and tried not to look ashamed. I sang Ave Maria for them because it was the kindest one I knew, and because my instructions that day were simple. Observe the widow, pass her contact information to my handler. I hated that one. The widow's instructions were always the worst. When the family drifted away through the gate, I gathered my prayer book and turned to leave. He was standing under a bare oak tree 12 feet away. He was not hiding. That was the first thing that alarmed me. Men who followed funeral singers to graveyards usually tried to look like they had a reason to be there. They pretended to read headstones or check their phones. Rafael Devereux was simply standing there, watching me, his hands in his pockets and his dark coat open despite the cold, as if the wind was not brave enough to bother him. I kept walking. You disappeared before I could reach you, he said. His voice was low and even. It carried across the gray air between us like it had always meant to reach me. I did not stop walking. I always disappear after a service. It's the job. You were not just singing. It was not a question. I stopped. I turned around slowly. My face was perfectly blank. I had practiced this face in the mirror for 3 years. It was the face that said, I am nobody. I am nothing. I am a ghost you cannot hold. I was singing a funeral hymn, I said. That's what funeral singers do. He walked toward me. He was unhurried and completely certain of himself, the way men are when they have never had a reason to rush. He stopped 5 feet away and looked at me with those dark, quiet eyes. Your voice broke on the 4th bar of the Lacrimosa, he said. Just once. Just for a fraction of a second. I have listened to that recording 11 times, and I am almost certain no one else noticed. The cold in my chest deepened. I almost noticed, he continued, because I was looking for something real in that church, and for one fraction of a second, your voice gave it to me. I stared at him. Behind the wall. Stay behind the wall. Mr. Devereux, I said, very quietly and very carefully. I am sorry for your loss. Your brother's service was an honor to perform. But I am not an interesting person, and I am not someone you should be spending your time on. I turned and walked away. I walked 3 blocks before my legs started shaking, and by then I was alone on a gray street, and nobody could see me, so I let them shake for exactly 30 seconds. Then I stopped, breathed, and kept moving. That night, I held Clara's hand while she slept. She was 18, and she was brilliant, and she deserved a whole world that kept trying to take everything from her. I pressed my lips to her forehead and stayed very still for a long time. I am doing this for you, I told her silently. I am doing all of it for you. She slept through her monitor's soft beeping. She didn't know what I was. I was performing at the Moetti Opera House when everything started to unravel. The Moettis were Raphael's enemies, which meant singing for them was either a trap set by the Black Requiem or a test. Possibly both. My instructions were buried in the second movement of Dies Irae, a half-step deviation in the 3rd bar that meant, the East Warehouse changes guards at 2 in the morning. I delivered it perfectly. Or I thought I did. Halfway through my closing aria, I saw Raphael in the crowd. He was not on the guest list. He was not supposed to be there. He was standing near the back wall in a black suit, and he was not watching the stage the way the other guests were. He was watching me the way someone watches a mathematical equation they are in the process of solving. My voice almost broke again. I caught it. I held it. I finished the piece. Backstage, the Moetti men were already waiting for me. There were 3 of them, large and cold-eyed, and one of them had a hand on his jacket in a way that meant he wasn't just there to thank me for the performance. The boss wants to have a conversation, the tallest one said. About your schedule. They meant the jinx. They meant the deaths that followed my services. They meant they thought I was working against them. Before any of them moved, Raphael walked through the stage door. He did it quietly and without hurry, and the shift in the air was immediate. The 3 Moetti men turned. They recognized him. The hand on the jacket went very still. She's finished for the evening, Raphael said. His voice was gentle and completely final. It was the most efficient act of violence I had ever witnessed, and no one had touched anyone. They let us pass. He guided me down a narrow corridor and into a dark prop room lined with old curtain fabric and broken stage flats. A single dim light hung from the ceiling. He closed the door. I pulled my arm from his grip and pressed myself against the far wall. "I didn't ask for your help," I said. "No," he agreed. He leaned against the opposite wall and looked at me in the dim light. "You wouldn't." My hands were freezing. They were always freezing, but in the cold of that prop room, they were numb to the wrist. He noticed. Without speaking, he peeled off his leather gloves and crossed the small space between us. He took my hands in both of his. His hands were warm. They were impossibly warm. I forgot to pull away for exactly 4 seconds. Then I stepped back. "Don't," I said. The word came out smaller than I intended. He looked at me steadily. "You are freezing, and you are shaking, and you almost just got taken by 3 men who would not have been gentle about their questions. I can handle myself." "I know you can." He said it simply, without condescension. "That's not why I helped you." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. The building hummed with the distant sound of the orchestra resuming outside. "Because I haven't slept in 4 days," he said finally, "and the only time my mind goes quiet is when I listen to you sing. And I find that extremely inconvenient." I looked at him. He looked back. Neither of us smiled. I grabbed my bag and my prayer book, and I left. But I did not forget the warmth of his hands for a very long time. The burner phone rang at 3 in the morning. I was awake, which I almost always was. Clara was asleep. Her monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The apartment was dark except for the small light I kept on in the kitchen because the dark had started doing things to me in the past few months that I didn't like to examine. I answered it. "Beautiful work at the Moretti house." The voice was flat and cold and completely without gender. It was always like that. Processed. Mechanical. Belonging to no one. "However, we have a complication." I waited. "Rafael Devereux has been seen at 3 of your recent services. He spent 11 minutes alone with you tonight. This is a problem, Lenora." My name in their mouth always sounded like a threat. "He followed me," I said. "I didn't invite him." Invitation is irrelevant. Proximity is the issue. If he decodes the music. He won't. He already suspects. A pause. "We need this resolved. Your next assignment is your most critical to date. Rafael Devereux visits his mother's grave every year on the anniversary of her death. This year, he will not leave that cemetery the same way he entered it." The room tilted slightly. "You want me to?" "We want you to sing the Dies Irae at the mausoleum wall at dawn on the 14th. The tempo shift in the second verse will confirm the sniper's position. You know the protocol?" "No." The word left my mouth before I had permission to say it. The silence on the other end was much worse than anything they could have said. "Your sister's treatment is funded through our arrangement, Lenora. The next payment is due in 9 days." I closed my eyes. "Furthermore," the voice continued, unhurried and terrible, "we received your sister's latest scans today. The development is encouraging. It would be a tragedy if her treatment were to be interrupted at this particular stage." The room went completely silent except for Clara's monitor. Beep, beep, beep. "I understand," I whispered. The call ended. I sat on the kitchen floor for a long time. The linoleum was cold under me. The light above the stove hummed. I pressed the back of my hand to my mouth and stayed very, very still. Then I thought of Raphael's hands, warm around my frozen ones. I thought of the way he said I haven't slept in 4 days like it cost him something to admit it. I thought of Julian's coffin covered in white lilies that his brother had probably chosen himself. And then I got up off the floor, because I had Clara to protect, and that was more than enough reason to keep breathing. And I started planning. I had 9 days to find a way out of the trap I had been building for 3 years. He found me at the cemetery on the 8th day. Not by accident. I had stopped believing in his accidents. He was standing near the gate of a small private burial, his coat dark against the grey morning, and when I came out through the iron door, he fell into step beside me without asking permission. "I know what your songs mean," he said. Everything in my body went cold and still. "I spent a week with a musicologist," he continued calmly, as if he were talking about the weather. "We mapped your vocal variations against a timeline of 26 incidents over the past 3 years. The pattern is consistent across every service. You aren't a curse, Lenora. You are a transmission." I kept walking. "If you are about to threaten me," I started. "I'm not." He stepped in front of me, gently. He didn't block my path so much as appear in it, making it easier to stop than to go around him. I am telling you that I know you are not doing this freely. I know you are not the one who chose this. And I know that whatever they are holding over you is significant enough that you have spent 3 years destroying your own life to protect it. I looked at him. His eyes were dark and serious and completely without judgment. That was the part that undid me. Not the warmth or the beauty or the terrifying competence of him. The complete absence of judgment in a world that had done nothing but judge me since the day I was born. You cannot help me, I said. My voice was very steady and very quiet and completely dishonest. I know, he said. Tell me anyway. I shook my head and walked around him. But that night, for the first time in 3 years, I cried. Not for myself. I had stopped crying for myself a long time ago. I cried because someone had finally seen what I was, not the curse, not the weapon, not the ghost. And he hadn't looked away. And in 3 days, I was going to lead him to a sniper's scope. The mausoleum was built from black marble and old grief. I arrived before dawn, which they required. The Devereux family cemetery was private. Stone walls, iron gates, bare trees like black stitches against the pale sky. A groundskeeper let me in through a side entrance and didn't look at me twice. I took my position near the mausoleum wall. The air was so cold I could see my breath. I opened my prayer book. My hands were the steadiest they had ever been in 3 years, which was wrong. My hands should have been shaking. But I had passed through fear and come out the other side into something colder and more certain. A kind of dead clarity. This was the last thing I was going to do for the Black Requiem. After today, either everything changed, or nothing mattered anymore. I had made a decision the night before, sitting on the kitchen floor again, Clara's cough carrying softly from the bedroom. I was done being their instrument. Whatever the cost. I heard the gate open. Raphael walked in alone. He was wearing a long black coat. He carried no flowers, which surprised me. He walked with his hands in his pockets, and his head slightly bowed. And for the first time since I had known him, he looked like something other than a sovereign. He looked like a son. He stopped in front of his mother's name carved into the marble. He didn't pray. He just stood there. I opened my mouth. And I sang the wrong thing. Not the Dies Irae. Not the encoded tempo, not the second verse with a half-step deviation that would have confirmed the sniper's position. Instead, I sang something I had not sung since I was 16 years old in a church in the city's poorest district with my mother's hand gripping mine. I sang a song of mercy. A simple, old, unarmed thing. No code. No signal. Nothing but sound. Raphael turned around slowly. He walked toward me, crossing the open ground between us, and I stood still and kept singing because stopping felt like dying, and I wasn't ready to die yet. He stopped 3 feet away. I finished the song. The silence afterward was enormous. The Dies Irae is what they sent you to sing, he said quietly. It was not a question. Yes, I said. The sniper was on the East Ridge. I know. My men cleared the ridge an hour ago. I knew you were coming, Lenora. I have known since the 8th day. He looked at me steadily. I let you come because I needed to know what choice you would make when you were standing here. My legs gave out. Not all the way. Not dramatically. But I sank down onto the bottom step of the mausoleum and pressed my hands over my face and held myself together with every piece of strength I had left, which was not very much. He sat down beside me. Not across from me. Beside me. His arm warm and solid and real against mine in the freezing air. Clara, I said. My voice came out wrecked. They fund her treatment. If I break the arrangement they said they would. Clara is safe. His voice was completely certain. I had her moved to a private facility under my protection 2 days ago. She doesn't know why. She thinks it's a specialist referral. I looked at him. He met my eyes without flinching. You moved my sister, I said. Without telling me. I needed to remove their leverage before I stood in an open courtyard, he said. I am many things, but I am not suicidal. Something between a sob and a laugh broke out of my chest. It was ugly and unpracticed and completely real. He looked at me like it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. They will come for me, I said. When they find out I didn't deliver. I know. He reached over and took my hand. My freezing, gloved hand in his warm, bare one. He didn't try to fix anything or explain anything or make promises he couldn't keep. He just held my hand and looked at his mother's name carved into the marble. We are going to have a very busy few days. Raphael, I said his name for the first time. It felt dangerous in my mouth. Why are you doing this? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. Old, yellowed at the edges. He held it out to me. It was a funeral program. Dated 12 years ago. Lenora Vesper. Beloved mother. I stared at it. Something in my memory stirred, slow and reluctant. I was 16 years old, he said quietly. My mother had just died, and Julian was 11, and I was standing by this wall, feeling the kind of emptiness that doesn't have a bottom. And a girl slipped past the guards, nobody knew how, nobody ever figured it out, and sat down on those steps. He nodded at the steps beneath us, and sang. For about 10 minutes. Just sang. For a boy she didn't know, because she saw him standing there alone. My throat closed. I was 13, I whispered. I used to slip into private services sometimes. I thought if I could sing for someone who was really hurting, it would count for something. It did, he said. It counted for everything. I looked for you after. You were gone. I spent years looking for a funeral singer with a voice like broken glass and a face like a saint who had given up on heaven. I pressed my free hand over my mouth. And then I heard you sing for Julian, he said, and I finally understood that some things find you when they are ready and not a single second before. The tears came then. Quietly, without drama. They simply arrived, the way grief arrives, not all at once but steadily, the way water finds every crack in old stone. The Black Requiem came in force 3 nights later. I was in Raphael's house, a real house, not a glass tower, but a large old building full of heavy furniture and too many rooms, when the call came through. Not the burner phone. They had burned that bridge. This was a direct call to Raphael's secure line, and the voice on the other end made demands that Raphael listened to in complete silence. Then he hung up. They want me to hand you over, he said. Obviously, I said. He looked at me across the kitchen table. There was something in his eyes that made my chest ache, not fear, not calculation, but a kind of clear, simple fury that was all the more frightening for being quiet. That is not something I am going to do, he said. Raphael. Lenora. He said my name the way I had said his, like it cost him something and he was paying it willingly. I spent 12 years looking for the girl who sang for me when the world was ending. I am not handing her to anyone. The battle, and it was a battle, 3 days of it, moving pieces across the city like a chess game played in real time, was not something I watched from a safe distance. Raphael tried to keep me in the house with guards and locked doors. I lasted approximately 4 hours before I told the guard politely but firmly to move, and went to find Raphael in his war room. He looked up when I entered. His jaw tightened. You should be. I know things, I said. 3 years of information. Guard rotations, warehouse locations, contact names, emergency protocols. Everything they ever sent me, I remember. I crossed the room and put my hands flat on the table over his map. Use me. He stared at me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he pulled out a chair. Sit down, he said. Tell me everything. I Saturday. And I told him. Every service. Every encoded him. Every signal, counter-signal, and emergency protocol that the Black Requiem had ever drilled into me over 3 years of systematic degradation. I gave him all of it. It took 6 hours. When I was finished, he was quiet for a moment. You held all of that, he said slowly. Alone. For 3 years. Clara needed her treatment, I said. He reached across the table. He covered my hand with his. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. It ended on a Tuesday. I know that because Clara called me on a Tuesday to say that the facility staff had told her she could walk the garden now without the portable monitor, and she had cried so hard she couldn't speak for a full minute, and I had sat on the floor of Raphael's kitchen and cried with her through the phone. The Black Requiem was dismantled over 11 days. I will not pretend it was clean or simple or that no one died. This is not that kind of story. People died. Raphael carried that weight the way he carried everything, quietly, completely, without passing it to anyone else. But Clara was safe. And I was free. The morning after it was over, I woke up in a guest room in Raphael's house and lay very still for a long time, waiting for the familiar weight to settle back on my chest. The weight I had carried every morning for 3 years. The dread, the calculations, the cold rehearsal of whatever lie I would need that day. It didn't come. The morning was just morning. Gray light through white curtains. The distant sound of the city. Someone moving in the kitchen below. I pressed my hands over my face and breathed. I cried again, but this time it felt different. This time it felt like something ending rather than something continuing. I got up and went downstairs. Rafael was in the kitchen making coffee with the focused intensity of a man who did not actually know how to make coffee and was refusing to admit it. He was in a dark sweater, and his hair was slightly messy, and he had a bruise along his jaw from the third day of operations that he had refused to have looked at. He looked completely, absolutely real. He handed me a cup without turning around. "It's terrible," he said. "I apologize in advance." I took a sip. It was terrible. "It's fine," I said. He turned around and looked at me. We had barely slept in 11 days. We had worked side by side through nights that felt like they were trying to break us, and we had disagreed, loudly, about strategy on at least 4 separate occasions, and once I had thrown a folder of documents at the wall because I was exhausted and furious, and he had let me be both without making it worse. And through all of it, he had never pushed. He had held my hand exactly twice. He had said my name with that careful weight exactly when it mattered. He was looking at me now the way he had looked at me in the cathedral, like something he recognized but couldn't quite place. Only now, standing in his kitchen in the ordinary morning light, I thought maybe I understood it better. He was looking at me like someone who had finally come home after a very long time away. "Clara wants to meet you," I said. Something shifted in his face. Small, controlled, but real. "Does she?" "I told her about you." I wrapped both hands around the cup. I told her. My throat tightened. I told her there was someone who found me when I wasn't looking to be found. He was quiet. "She said she wants to shake his hand and then yell at him for being a mafia boss," I continued. "In that order." He smiled. Fully. For the first time I had ever seen. It changed his whole face, the way sunlight changes the color of water. "She sounds like her sister," he said. I looked at him across the kitchen. 3 years of walls. 3 years of cold mornings and encoded hymns and the performance of being nobody. 3 years of surviving in a world that treated me like a useful instrument and called it an arrangement. And here, in an ordinary kitchen, with terrible coffee and a bruised jaw and a man who had been looking for me since he was 14 years old. "Rafael," I said. "Lenora," he answered. I crossed the kitchen. He was very still, the way he was always very still. Not from coldness, but from the discipline of a man who knew the value of waiting for the right thing rather than reaching for the nearest one. I stood in front of him. I looked up. "Thank you," I said. "For Clara. For the mausoleum. For sitting beside me instead of across from me." I paused. "For not looking away." He reached up slowly and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was careful and warm and entirely deliberate. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for singing for a boy who needed it." I closed the distance. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not a collision or a claiming or any of the things I might have imagined in a different life. It was quiet and steady and real. His hand came to rest against my jaw, and mine pressed flat against his chest, where I could feel his heartbeat, and neither of us needed the world to stop. It was already quiet enough. 3 weeks later, Clara sat in the garden of the facility in the thin winter sun and played her cello. She was wearing a yellow coat, and her hair was loose, and she played something I did not recognize, something she had composed herself, she said, during the long months of treatment. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. Rafael sat beside me on the bench. Not touching. Just beside me, in the way he had learned to be present without pressure, close without claiming. He watched Clara play. "She's extraordinary," he said quietly. "She is," I agreed. Clara looked up and caught my eye across the garden. She grinned, wide and bright and completely unguarded in the way only people who have nearly lost everything can grin when they find themselves still here. I smiled back. For the first time in 3 years, I did not count the reasons the world was ending. I just listened to my sister play. And let myself stay.